Hi, I'm Samantha Bryant. I write the Menopausal Superheroes series, and I'm out here in my garden today to talk about submitting your work. And since I'm out here in my garden, I bet you're going to hear some dogs and cars, but hopefully you can hear me too. So I chose to sit outside first off because it is a gorgeous day, and why should I be inside? And secondly, because I'm in my garden, and a garden is actually a pretty darn good metaphor for submitting your work. You do your best, you sow seeds, and you do the best you can to help them thrive, but there are a whole lot of factors that are out of your control as to whether your black-eyed Susans are going to bloom in profusion or not. So similarly, in a writing life, when you're submitting your work, there are things you can do to increase the likelihood of your writing life thriving and your work finding homes. But there are other factors that are completely out of your control, and so you have to accept some of that. So let's talk about submitting your work. So first off, submitting your work is hard. You probably already knew that. But if you want any kind of audience for your work, it's something you're going to have to do. Even if you are going to completely be an indie publisher who never submits their work to an anthology or an editor or a magazine of any kind, but just publishes all your work yourself, you are still submitting your work because you're submitting it to the reader. And the reader is going to have judgments about the quality of that work, right? So the first thing you've got to work on is that thick skin. You hear people talk about that all the time, the ability to take criticism. No matter how wonderful your piece of work is, your short story, your poem, your novel, it doesn't matter. There's going to be people who don't like it. And so if you're submitting your work to publishers, it's going to get rejected. And if you're not submitting your work to publishers, it's going to get poor reviews. Somebody's not going to like it. So the first thing you got to do is get over that emotional hurdle. That's sending your baby out there knowing that the world is going to criticize it. And the world will not always be kind about its criticism. You know, writers, in my experience, try to be kind when they're trying to help another writer. They try to phrase things nicely. But readers who are giving you reviews on Amazon, if they don't like your book, they're not going to pull any punches about it. And you can't take every single one of those criticisms deeply to heart and keep going. So you've got to work on thickening your skin. So assuming that you've gotten that far, then there's submitting your work. So besides being hard, it's also work. I know, additional work, right? Like developing a writing life isn't enough work. But there's so much logistics surrounding submitting your work. First off, there's researching your publishing venues. So who's open to submissions right now? What kind of work do they take? Like what genre? What length of work do they take? Do they, are they only open certain times of year? Are they only open to certain kinds of people? Right? Just, who can submit to this venue and when, and it's complicated. So to find out about places, I subscribe to a few different things. I subscribe to C. Hope Clark's Funds for Authors, or Funds for Writers, or Funds for Authors. I'll have to look it up. But anyway, it's a newsletter that she sends out once a week on Fridays, the free version. She also has a paid version, and it will give you publishing information from names of publishers to names of agents to anthologies or magazines that have calls. It's a good source of a lot of information for a lot of different kinds of writing. I also subscribe to Authors Publish, which is a much shorter newsletter. It usually only has 2 or 3 links in a go. It also comes out about once a week, and it includes craft articles and publishing information. I'm a big fan of Erica Varillo's Publishing and Other Forms of Insanity. That's a blog, and one of the things that she does on her blog is aggregate publishing opportunities. And I subscribe to her blog so that I get them in my email and don't have to remember to keep going back and looking. They just pop up in my email. I also use a group on Facebook called Open Call, and that's where people who learn about publishing opportunities can just post and say, hey, by the way, this magazine is looking for this kind of stuff. And other things I found just kind of through other writers. A big source for me lately is there's a writer friend I have online. His name is Ray Daly, and he's been doing what he calls a submission challenge. He's done them 3 times now, one in September, one in January, and one in May, and I participated all 3 times. And it was really good because he's also a speculative fiction writer, so the venues that he researched and chose were venues I could also use for the most part. And the idea is that you submit one piece of your writing every day for the whole month. So for September, for January, and for May. And that was really useful because if I'm really going to submit one piece of writing every day for a month, I don't have time to spend a lot of time angsting over each submission, right? I just make a decision and go with it. And it's led to a few publications for me. A lot of rejections, but a lot of rejections is part of the process. So besides looking into who's taking the work when, finding the opportunities, then you've got to look into those opportunities themselves. What are your goals for the work? Does it matter to you that you get paid, or are you willing to do it to have your work published for free for the idea of exposure? Most of us have to do that at least early on. It takes some time to get to a point where you're actually getting paid for your work. Do you have a goal like being a member of the SFWA or something like that? I know I do, and so when I have a new piece to submit, I always start with SFWA qualifying venues in hopes of accumulating enough of those credits that I can eventually become a member. Does working on a particular project like an anthology or with a certain editor on a magazine give you a useful connection that might be good for your later career? Those are all things to look into. And then when you find out about a venue, look at it, right? What do they publish? Are they publishing what you're writing, or are you just wasting your time sending them something that is not what they publish? Or if what they're publishing is not something you've written before, is it something you want to try? I have more than once heard about an interesting anthology call and then wrote a story with that anthology call in mind. And sometimes it's worked that anthology took it and published it, and other times it hasn't, but I still ended up with a new story. So it can be a good opportunity to get yourself to step outside of your box a little bit and try something new. And then the last thing is watching out for scams, because I always go to Writer Beware anytime I'm considering working with a publisher and see if anything scary, nasty, or heinous has happened with that publisher, such as people not getting paid or abusive behavior or any of the isms. Ugh. So before I can even get to submitting my work, there's all this work. And I think that's part of what keeps a lot of writers from submitting their work that much. And once you've picked venues to submit your work to, there's additional work because you have to prepare your manuscript for what that publisher wants. And this is really important because you can get your work rejected without even being looked at if you can't follow the directions. And most publishers have on their websites, in their submission guidelines, it tells you exactly what they want. Like, do they want a certain font? Do they want the Shun manuscript format? Or do they want it blind with no identifying information on it? Font type, do they want you to send them an RTF, a .doc, a .docx, a PDF, or copy and paste it into some kind of submission manager? Do they want things in an email or through a submission manager? And you have to follow all those instructions, and they are not the same from magazine to magazine. So you really have to read them each time, unless you've worked with that magazine before and you've kind of got them in your head. So there's a lot to consider. So then, once you've sent your work out there, another thing is tracking it. So I like to use Duotrope. It costs $5 a month. And I find it really useful because it has a lot of filters, and I can put in and I can see, okay, what stories have I already sent to this magazine? Or where have I sent this story? And get a list of all the different places that have rejected it along the line. I think tracking is a good idea because eventually you'll be submitting a lot of work, and you want to be submitting a lot of work. You don't want to submit one story and then just sit there waiting for the response. There lies madness. Don't do it. Instead, you need to keep on writing new work and keep on submitting that work. And I also find that it makes each rejection less painful. Currently I believe I have 21 things out on submission right now. So I'm not sitting here thinking about any particular one of them. Every few days I tend to get a piece of news, and then when it gets down again and I have most of my work that was going to get rejected has been rejected, then I look at sending it back out again. I tend to send it all out in batches a few times a year. So the other thing I like about Duotrope is the way I can look at my unpublished work and I can sort it by things like how long it is, what genre it is, so that if I'm looking at a particular call, I'll be like, well, do I have anything in my unpublished catalog that would fit this? And then you can send that in. So once you've submitted your work, then you're going to start collecting rejections. Aren't they fun? No, of course they're not fun. But here's the thing. Don't read too much into a rejection. I'm finding that the more rejections I collect, and last I checked, I had 264 of them. Different publishers have kind of set rejections they send, and there's kind of the more encouraging one, which says something like, we wish you the best, but this isn't going to work for us. We hope you'll submit work in the future. They don't put that part, we hope you'll submit work in the future, if they really thought your stuff was terrible. And then there's the less encouraging one that just kind of non-specifically says, thanks but no thanks, this isn't for us. And those are just kind of standard, and I don't think you should try to read too much that's personal about it into it, because those are really boilerplate, and everybody who got rejected got one of those, and it doesn't really say anything about your work in particular. If you do get feedback, if somebody took the time to add a sentence that's specifically about your work, then value that, because editors and slush pile readers and all the different people who are making the decisions going up the chain are very busy people, and if they took the time to do that, they saw something in your work that had enough potential, that they wanted to help you, that they wanted to say, oh, so close, if only. They wanted to give you that little bit of advice. So don't blow it off without at least considering that they might be right, that whatever they said is wrong with your story might be wrong, that you might need to consider a revision. We're all learning our craft all the time. All of us can get better. I also think it's important to track and note patterns. So if I look at one of my stories that's received a lot of rejections, then maybe that's a sign that I need to look at that story again. Maybe that story needs some revision. Maybe there's something that just isn't working. You know, openings are so important. If you can't capture people in the first couple of sentences, then they've moved on. So maybe the opening of that story just isn't strong enough. I also find it helpful to look at particular publishers that I'm aiming at working with and see how much of my work they've rejected. And if they've rejected a bunch, that might be a sign that what I'm writing and what they're publishing are not the same thing. And so I should really just be looking at different places. It can also be a sign that I just haven't been lucky, because really, I mean, when I get a rejection these days, I just shrug and move on. It doesn't hurt as much personally when you've had a few of them, and when you realize that a lot of times no from one venue is exactly that. It's no from one venue. Do you know how many venues there are? Oh my goodness, so many. It doesn't mean that your work is unworthy or that you are not talented or skilled. A lot of times a rejection can have nothing to do with your work. It can be just like, okay, in this anthology we've agreed to accept this many pieces, and we only have this much space for the length book we've planned. So if your story is 8,000 words and they only had room for 5,000 words, they're not going to take yours, even if your 8,000 word story is beautiful, right? Because they don't want to rework their whole plan for the book because they've accepted work that's too long. It can also have to do with things like you wrote on a similar theme to a story that they already accepted, and they're like, oh, this is a really good story about crows, but you know what, we already have a story about crows in this issue, so it's not, we don't want another one. So, and even if the reason is that publisher didn't like your work, that is one publisher's opinion about your work, and publishers are just people, unlike any other readers. Some readers are going to like your work, some readers are not going to like your work. So if that reader turns out not to be yours, go look for another one. They're everywhere. So there's my 2 cents for what it's worth about submitting your work. I hope that you find it useful. I hope you enjoyed sitting here in the garden, talking to my frog prince and my gazing ball. So, thanks.